Hello, my name is Mertis J. Thompson, and I'm living here in Seattle, Washington. I've just completed a book, Emmitt, Till, and Me. And in the book, it tells how Emmitt's life affected me as a teenager going into the U.S. Navy. After his death, I was frustrated and very angry. And I joined the Navy with the intent of being a journalist apprentice. But when I got to my duty station and reported to my superiors, they informed me that that position was no longer available to me. But because of Emmitt's death and the anger that I felt at the way that he was killed, I refused to accept a lesser position in the Navy. They told me that my only alternative was to become a steward. Steward's job in the Navy were to clean officers' quarters, shine their shoes, and prepare anything that they needed. But I was not going to accept that. And it was because of my anger over Emmitt's death that I refused to accept a lesser position. In fact, I informed my superiors that they could send me back home, put me in the brig, that's a Navy jail, but I was not going to be a servant to officers. That came about, like I said, mainly because of the anger over the way that Emmitt Till was killed. He was 14 when he was killed. I was only 17, but it didn't matter the ages. That same anger was what allowed Rosa Parks to not give up her seat to a white person on a bus. So there were many people that were angered over his death, but I can only speak from my perspective. Getting back to the Navy and the base that I was on in San Diego, I became a clerk or a personnelman, a person that keeps records. But on that base that I was on, because I refused to accept a lesser position, the editor of a civilian newspaper heard that I wanted to be a writer for the Navy, and he allowed me to be a contributing writer for his paper. And I would go around and interview enlisted men about the stories of their lives in the Navy, what they were doing. I also wrote a lot of love letters for people who didn't have the capacity to write love letters to their loved ones back home. So that allowed me to be a writer just by the impact of his death. I refused to accept anything less. Over the years, I've written a number of books, but I attribute my being a writer was taking a stand against the injustice that the Navy wanted me to accept. And his life has motivated me to make contributions that I never would have thought of making. Growing up as a kid in the South, I was not allowed to go into the public library. In fact, my entry into the public library system was, it came about when I was 30 years old in Chicago. And that was when I met Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was against slavery. And I became a student of Emerson. But it was because of Emmitt's death that motivated me. What should I do?
Hold on a second, because I can at this.
Is that okay? Emmitt's death was also the catalyst for the civil rights movement. Dr. King was enraged at his death, and he mobilized millions of people around the country to fight injustice, to see that this would never happen again. For many years, I've had fears of going to Mississippi because of the way that Emmitt was killed. But now I've changed that. In fact, I've also forgiven the killers that did this horrible crime. The lady that the crime was supposed to have been done against, or what Emmitt was supposed to have said something, she later said that he never said those things. And whatever he could have done was nothing. His death should not have been the cause of whatever he had done, because it really wasn't about that. This book also, it talks about how black people felt at the trial. Were they afraid, I mean, you know, to even come to the trial? You have to remember, this was a hostile environment that was dominated by the whites of Mississippi at that time. But because of the opening of the Civil Rights Museum in Jackson, Mississippi, I've changed my mind about going to Mississippi, and I'm going to the museum and tell my story in Jackson, Mississippi. So this is about inclusion and how we can overcome unconscious bias that we might have against other countries, other cultures, other people of color. We can overcome unconscious bias if we choose to. It's a choice. It's a choice. We're all here on this planet for a purpose. And my purpose is to fight injustice as long as I can. And I can actually see that, however it might seem, that his death had a purpose, because it has mobilized many people around the world, not only in this country, to fight against the injustices that are done to people of lesser abilities, capacities, or whatever. So I can actually say that my book allows me to release the anger, the frustration I had over his death, and to forgive, actually forgive his killers for the first time in my life. Thank you. And that was the point. I mean, to forgive those guys. I mean, really. I never thought about it until I got into this book.